One of the most badass moments in Nirvana happens at the very beginning of Live and Loud. Amidst the chaos of radio-friendly unit shifters opening noise, we see Pat Smear calmly tossing his cigarette aside before launching into one of the greatest and most menacing Nirvana riffs. The beautiful red guitar that he is playing is his modified 1970s Hagstrom H2N. Although the majority of people know Pat from being in Nirvana and the Foo Fighters, he made history and left his mark on punk rock over 10 years before he joined Nirvana, thanks to the groundbreaking and genre-defining music of his first band, the Germs. In all three of these bands, there is the iconic frontman that gets the spotlight the majority of the time, but I believe that Pat is one of the most overlooked guitarists in rock. He is a punk pioneer who humbly lives in the shadows and has a resume that very few, if any, can rival. I also believe his cherry red Hagstrom is overlooked as well. In this video, I'm going to present to you why this fierce machine is one of punk and alternative rock's coolest guitars. Ever since I started my channel, people have been borderline begging for videos on Pat's gear and tones. My most recent addition to my collection is a build of Pat's main weapon of choice while he was in Nirvana. This guitar looks, feels, and plays completely different than anything I currently have or anything I have ever played, to be frank. It's been a really inspiring and refreshing instrument, and I cannot tell you how excited I am that it is a reality and it is finished. Also in this video, I will be showing you everything that went into this build. But first, to truly understand the story of Pat's Hagstrom, we need to start at the very beginning. In the 70s, while attending an alternative high school, a young George Ruthenberg met Jan Beam. They quickly became a duo that made themselves a known presence at school. They frequently did LSD together, and soon they developed a following of other students who also used the drug. They were accused of brainwashing other students and causing them to behave subversively, which led to the school expelling both of them. Not long after their dismissal from school, they began trying to form a band. After going through different names and lineups, they eventually settled on the Germs. George then took on the stage name of Pat Smear, and Jan initially became Bobby Pin. After they made their first initial recordings, Bobby changed his stage name to Darby Crash. The final lineup of the Germs went on to record G.I., their one and only studio album. This is considered the first true full-length hardcore punk record, and its influence cannot be overstated. It has a near mythic status in the punk world. There was absolutely nothing that sounded like it. Simply put, the Germs were well ahead of their time. Pat geniusly layered guitars to provide a thick and intricate wall of aggression. He went beyond the typical 3-chord punk chugs of the day, with atypical chord progressions that were more complex and thought out. One could classify Darby's vocal style as more of a snarl than actual singing. While the lyrics are borderline incoherent at times, the passion, energy, and anger in his vocal delivery is undeniable and commanding. If you look behind the venom, you'll find that he was a brilliant and very gifted writer. This wasn't widely recognized until years after his death. His lyrics now, rightly so, are held up as poetic art. Since Darby's vocal style didn't naturally lean into melody, Pat filled the void and brought in hooks and leads that made the guitar melodically carry the song, an approach you didn't often find in the fast, aggressive punk of the time. The story of Pat's red Hagstrom H2N starts at the Germs' final show, which took place on December 3rd, 1980. The band had broken up in May of that year, and this was their big reunion, a sold-out show at the Starwood in Los Angeles. His Hagstrom was bought that month for that show at Guitar Center for $125. Believe it or not, this is actually the first guitar he ever owned. Up until that show, he he literally just borrowed and relied on other bands' guitars for shows and recording sessions. That's why in Germs footage, the variety of guitars you see him playing go all over the place. Recording guitar on one of the most influential punk albums while not actually owning a guitar of your own is probably one of the most punk rock things ever done. People usually obsess and labor over their guitar setup, configuration, and sound, while in the late 70s, Pat Smear was making history with whatever was nearby that he could borrow. There are some brilliant pictures from this final Germs show that give us our first look at this guitar. It appears to be completely stock, which makes sense as he probably only had it for a few days at this point. Some notable things to point out is that there is no Hagstrom logo on the headstock, and one of the knobs appears to be either wrapped in something or is taped in place. This reunion show is largely seen as the Germs' best show, and everyone in the band thought this was the start of the reunited band's next chapter. Everyone except for Darby, that is. At the show, he said to the crowd, "We did this show so you new people could see what it was like when we were around. You're not going to see it again." 4 days later, on December 7th, 1980, Darby committed suicide by intentionally overdosing on heroin. He was 22 years old. His death in large was overshadowed by the murder of John Lennon, who was shot and killed the next day, on December 8th. The final Germs show was later released as a live album called Live at the Starwood, where we can hear Pat's Hagstrom in its first form. After the Germs, Pat would go on to release 2 solo albums and have short stints in numerous bands throughout the 80s and early 90s. In an interview he did with the Nirvana fan club website, Pat said his red Hagstrom has been used in every band he's been in. Indeed, we can see him playing it in various bands throughout the 80s. This is Pat performing with 45 Grave, and his guitar appears to be in the same form we saw it in at the Germs' final show, stock and with the covered knob. But here, there are some changes, as we see Pat playing it in the twisted roots. The bridge pickup has now been changed. A fun anecdote is that back in the day, Pat didn't own a soldering iron, so when changing pickups, he would twist the wires together and drip candle wax on the connection. There is also a round sticker now on the body, which we will later see moved when he joined Nirvana. Pat met and became friends with Courtney Love when they were both in the 1984 film Breaking. It was through Courtney that Pat would get connected to Kurt. Although Nirvana will forever be one of the most iconic power trios, Kurt had said that the band was always meant to be a 4-piece with 2 guitarists. In 1989, Jason Everman was in Nirvana, but him and Kurt's personalities clashed, which led to his stint in the band being very short-lived. Around this time, Kurt asked Jay Mascis, the genius and monster guitarist of Dinosaur Jr., if he would join Nirvana. He asked him twice, and Jay did not accept. Story goes that later on, Kurt supposedly also asked Buzz Osborne of the Melvins to join, but Buzz said no, as he did not want to dissolve the Melvins. So we can safely speculate that adding another guitarist was always lingering in Kurt's mind throughout his entire career. While preparing to tour and promote In Utero, Kurt was telling Courtney how he wanted another guitarist in the band. It was Courtney's suggestion that Kurt give her friend Pat a call. Dave Grohl has said that everyone in Nirvana worshipped the Germs and were hugely influenced by them. This even goes for Nirvana members beyond Kurt, Chris, and Dave. There are Bleach-era photos of Chad Channing performing with a Germs t-shirt. In 1993, while working in a record store, Pat received a call from Kurt Cobain asking him to join Nirvana as a second guitarist for an upcoming tour. At first, Pat thought this was a friend of his playing a prank on him. As Pat himself has said in interviews, prior to this he had met Kurt once or twice but didn't really know him at all, and there was no audition. Pat said yes, and that was it, he was in. Asked by someone he barely knew to join a band in which he had never met any of the other members. Add to this that this is Nirvana in 1993, one of the biggest bands in the world preparing for their upcoming headlining tours. Talk about jumping onto a moving train. Pat's Hagstrom went through several mods in preparation for the In Utero tour. Nirvana guitar tech Ernie Bailey switched out the pickups to be a Seymour Duncan JB in the bridge position and a Seymour Duncan 59 in the neck. He believes that they kept the original Hagstrom pickup rings, but used electrical tape to keep the strings from hooking onto the bobbins of the Duncans. Ernie also installed new knobs, which he believes were from something like a Univox Badass. New tuners were installed along with an ABR1 tune-o-matic bridge. The sticker we saw on the body earlier was now moved to the headstock. Much like Kurt's Skystang 1 on the American leg versus the European leg of the tour, the Hagstrom seems to have gone through subtle changes depending on the time frame. It's hard to tell, but based off pictures, it looks like the original pickup rings were there from October to November, and there was no tape. But by Live and Loud in December, the rings are gone and the tape is there. It also looks like sometime in between Nirvana's second to last and last ever show, that the original H2N tailpiece was removed and a stop tail was installed. In Utero Tour guitar tech Jim Vincent recalled that his first time meeting Pat was the first day of tour rehearsals in October '93. He believes that the Hagstrom was either the only guitar Pat owned at the time or the only one he had brought for the tour. So, just like Kurt, Pat was given brand new Strats from Fender for the tour. The Hagstrom seems to have been used for the songs in standard tuning, while his Strats were set up for the drop D songs. This guitar, which started its performing career by being played at an influential punk band's last ever show, was now the main guitar occupying stage left on Nirvana's biggest headlining tours. It is the guitar we see Pat play the most in Nirvana. We get really great looks of it at all the televised performances from that tour, Live and Loud, Canal Plus, and The Tunnel. Pat, unfortunately, was only in the band for 7 months, from September '93 until Kurt's death in April '94. I know a lot of die-hard Nirvana fans live by the fall '91 era of the band. It's subjective and a matter of personal preference, of course, but I personally believe that Nirvana were at their peak when Pat was in the band, and he is a big reason why. I can understand why Kurt always envisioned his band being a 4-piece with 2 guitars. Pat really rounds out the sound and becomes a steady backbone locked in with Christ. To go from 1 to 2 guitars was, I think, one of the many steps Nirvana took to quote-unquote step up their production to keep up with the level of how big the band had gotten. They were no longer a sweaty trio playing packed shows in tiny clubs that held a few hundred people. They were now a well-oiled professional machine, traveling with a production designed for arenas and auditoriums that held thousands of people. To put it simply, having 2 guitars playing the same thing panned left and right naturally sounds bigger than just having 1 guitar playing that same part somewhere in the off-center. As simple as most Nirvana songs are, Pat did more than just merely copy what Kurt was playing. In comparison to Kurt, Pat played in a much more traditional way. Kurt lived by his 2-finger power chords. A huge part of Nirvana's sound comes from the specific way he barred those chords. But while Kurt played these power chords, Pat played bar chords. He also played the full open chords in the traditional way, where Kurt would play the power chord version for all of them but G. This added an entirely new dimension to Nirvana's sound. Not only did the guitars naturally sound bigger, but they also had much more musicality and depth. In some instances, these full chords bring out new melodies that weren't there before. Much like he did in the Germs, Pat was making his guitar sing and carry melodies. It's no secret that Kurt was always playing around and tinkering with his idea of what Nirvana's sound should be. We can see this by listening to all the different times the band recorded the song Sappy and how different each version sounds. I believe that when Pat joined the band, Nirvana had gotten the closest to how Kurt had always envisioned. He spent Nirvana's entire career looking for a second guitarist, and he found the perfect guitar companion and one of his punk rock heroes. After the end of Nirvana, Dave Grohl formed a band to support his self-titled debut album in which he had recorded all the instruments for. Pat joined this group from its inception in October 1994, and this band is what would become the Foo Fighters. Pat's first record with the Foos is The Color and the Shape, which was released in 1997 and is one of the all-time great rock albums. Its 3 singles, Monkey Wrench, Everlong, and My Hero, topped the charts when they were released and are all widely regarded as classics today. This album is just an early chapter in what the Foo Fighters are today, one of the biggest and most successful rock bands of all time. Ernie recalls that the red Hagstrom may have been used on an early Foo Fighters tour. Seen as it was seemingly his main guitar just a few years prior in Nirvana, I think it's safe to speculate that it might have been used to some capacity on The Color and the Shape, but don't quote me on that. That's just my guess. Pat left the Foo Fighters shortly after the release of the album, citing exhaustion from the band's relentless touring schedule. During his hiatus from the Foo Fighters, Pat kept a low profile. He was a producer on an album and was also a creative consultant on What We Do Is Secret, a movie about Darby Crash and the Germs. The surviving members of the Germs also had a brief reunion around this time. They were fronted by Shane West, the actor who portrayed Darby in the movie. From 2005 to 2010, Pat began performing select shows with the Foos again as a touring musician, often not for the entirety of the concert. He officially rejoined as a full-time contributing member around late 2010, his first album back being Wasting Light. This is my personal favorite Foo Fighters album. Pat has been on every Foo album since then. I searched near and far for any pictures or videos of the red Hagstrom being used in the Foo Fighters, but I couldn't find anything. As stated earlier, Pat himself has said that this guitar was used in every band he's been in, so it's safe to conclude that it was used early on in the Foo Fighters to some extent. Present day, it seems like this guitar might have been retired, which would make sense considering the mileage on it and its impressive resume. And at the end of the day, this is still Pat's first guitar. Is there any other guitar that we can say was used in a legendary and iconic band not once or twice, but 3 times? This is what I mean when I say that this red Hagstrom is one of the most overlooked guitars in rock music. Pat is still an avid and passionate user of Hagstrom guitars. In 2013, Hagstrom released the Pat Smear signature model. The black on black model is absolutely gorgeous. This one is currently at the top of my want list. Very recently, Pat made his look even cooler by getting custom redesigned pickguards. Truly a sleek stunner of a guitar. This is my build of Pat's red Hagstrom, modded to how he had it when he was in Nirvana. There is so much work that went into this build. It started out as a Hagstrom F20T. For years, I'd been keeping an eye out for a Hagstrom H2N, but never found a good deal on one. I saw this F20T pop up for $200, and coincidentally, around the same time, a vintage red H2N neck popped up for $250. I was on the fence for a little bit, but I ultimately decided to go the Partcaster route with this one, so I got both. Funny enough, it looks like Pat himself might have played F20Ts during the Germs reunion. I didn't realize this until I already had mine, so it was technically already a Pat Smear guitar to begin with. I've put together Partcasters from scratch before, but the work this one was going to need was way above my experience level. I sent all the parts out to my good friend Jeff from Lomic Guitars, who is truly a guitar wizard who can make anything possible. As you can clearly see from these before and after pictures, it's basically a completely different guitar now. Along with the vintage neck, it got a custom pickguard, vintage H2N tailpiece, ABR1 2-nomatic bridge, gold knobs, kill switch, Seymour Duncan 59 and Seymour Duncan JB. A fun thing that I asked to be added is the JB has a coil split option when pulling up its volume knob. The Tunomatic and JB are both what came stock on my Kurt Cobain signature Mustang. Very nerdy thing, but I'm really happy these two pieces were repurposed for another In Utero tour guitar. One of the main ones too. Thank you so much, Jeff, for putting up with all my crazy requests for this one and for all the work you put into it. There is a hole from where the original bridge used to be, which I have simply covered with a decal. Down the line, I might try to find a way to make this more discreet, but I'm content with the way it is for now. I had to throw in a nod to one of the greatest punk albums ever recorded. It's got a Germs circle on the back. From all the videos I've made of my builds when they were just finished, you have probably gathered that I get in honeymoon phases with new guitars pretty hard. But I swear, there is something about this one, as it is literally completely different to anything I have ever played. The neck is considerably thicker compared to my offsets and strats that I regularly play, so it has a feel that was really foreign to me at first. When I started playing it for the very first time, my left hand started getting tired and sore really quick, something that never happens, and I think it's from me not being used to playing a neck this size. It forced me to hold down chords and position my thumb in a slightly different way, which weirdly enough has been really inspiring. I usually just play Nirvana and dial in Kurt tones for a while when I have a new Nirvana related build, but my Hagstrom inspired me to start writing right away. I didn't have the usual instant urge to play covers or recreate tones with it. It's been really refreshing to have something so different. It made me step out of the box I'm usually in. Plus, objectively, it just looks so cool. The cherry red, black, and gold color scheme with matching headstock is really hard to beat. In October 2024, I briefly met Pat backstage at Austin City Limits. This was like the 500th insane thing that had happened that day. I was there with Ernie Bailey and Kurt's brother Chad Cobain, and this was right after I had documented and played Kurt's actual Skystang 1. This is how Ernie introduced me to Pat. This is Eric. He is like a scholar for Kurt's guitars. No one knows more about them than he does. It was already nerve-wracking to be backstage at a Foo Fighters show, so I just about melted when Ernie, the one who truly knows the most about Kurt's gear, introduced me like that. I shook Pat's hand and said, "Hi, I'm such a big fan." Without missing a beat, Pat raised his hand and said, "Oh, stop it, you," which had all of us laughing. Thank you, Pat Smear, for being so approachable and welcoming, and most of all, thank you for all the music.
Thank you so much for watching. Follow me on Instagram at Nirvana Guitars, and subscribe and check out my other Nirvana gear videos right here on YouTube.